Good morning, everyone. At the very heart of the hope of Israel is the certain conviction that the Lord Jesus Christ will return to the earth to set up the kingdom of God, to fulfill the promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And a key component of that understanding is the fact that the nation of Israel would return to their land. And so Bible believers have been keen to see any sign that that might be happening. Now today, we in fact stand in 2008, which is 160 years since Brother Thomas wrote Elpis Israel, the book in which he expounded his understanding of these things. And it is 60 years since the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. So today we want to review some of the prophecies that underlie that understanding about the return of the Jews to their land. We want to consider some of the highlights of this succeeding of the last 160 years. And also, we want to consider how the Brotherhood responded to those events. Let's start then with Brother Thomas, who in 1848, after 12 years of having deliberated and diligently searched the scriptures, came to an understanding of the truth and came to this country in 1848 and lectured and toured all over the country, telling people about his understanding of the Bible. And at the end of that series of lectures, somebody said to him, well, wouldn't it be grand if you could write that down in a book and then we'd have a more permanent record? And so, in 1848-9, he sat down and wrote Elpis Israel, the hope of Israel. Now, in that book, he wrote some key passages that talked about the return of Israel to their land. And I want to review those first of all, and then we shall look at some of the prophecies underlying them. The truth is, there are two stages in the restoration of the Jews. The first is before the Battle of Armageddon, and the second after it, but both premillennial. God has said, I will save the tents of Judah first. I'm going to look at this in a little more detail, but for now, just recognize there are two stages, says Brother Thomas, in Israel being restored. There is then a partial and primary restoration of Jews before the manifestation, before the Lord Jesus Christ is revealed to the world. This pre-adventual colonization of Palestine will be on purely political principles, and the Jewish colonists will return in unbelief of the messiahship of Jesus and of the truth as it is in him. So Jews are to return to the land of Israel. And what's more, they are to return under political principles and in unbelief to establish a colony. These are key points in Brother Thomas's understanding. They will emigrate thither as agriculturalists and traders in the hope of ultimately establishing their commonwealth, but more immediately of getting rich in silver and gold by commerce with India and in cattle and goods under the efficient protection of the British power. So their initial objective is to prosper through trade and agriculture. Although, interestingly, he opens up the possibility of there being an ultimate objective to establish a commonwealth, or we might say a state. And what's more, they would live in the land of Israel under the protection, he says, of Britain. And he goes on to speak a little more about this. I know not whether the men who at present contrive the foreign policy of Britain entertain the idea of assuming the sovereignty of the Holy Land and of promoting its colonization by the Jews. They will be compelled by events soon to happen to do what under existing circumstances heaven and earth combined could not move them to attempt. So certain is Brother Thomas of the prophecies of the Almighty that regardless of how likely it might look, he can put forward his understanding of Britain's role. So Britain will be compelled to rule Palestine. And indeed, Britain would encourage the Jews to return to the land, promote its colonization, he said. And then he refers plainly to Ezekiel chapter 38. This, their expectation of returning to trade and prosper in agriculture, will not be deceived, for before Gog invades their country, it is described by the prophet as a land of unwalled villages whose inhabitants are at rest and dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates, and possessed of silver and gold, cattle and goods, dwelling in the midst of the land. So quite plainly in that passage, drawing on Ezekiel 38, which is to become, of course, a key passage in the understanding. Israel has to have developed some prosperity, says Brother Thomas, from that chapter in order for Gog to come down and invade them. So let us simply summarize those points. The Jews are to return to Israel. They're to be the subject of a two-stage return. They return initially to establish a colony in unbelief of the Lord Jesus. They prosper by trade and agriculture. Britain has a key role both in returning the Jews to the land, supporting them when they're there, and having some role in ruling Palestine. But before we just look at the prophecies that underlay that understanding, bear in mind the context. When Brother Thomas wrote these things and the result of all his diligent investigations into Scripture, the great cause of misapprehension, the reason why people don't understand things in the way he does now, is the allegorizing method of Origen. This early church father, after the times of the apostles, who had put forward a way of interpreting Scripture, which he now explains, they have construed all those glorious promises of a political restoration. Lord, wilt thou at this time restore the kingdom to Israel, into nothing more than a spiritual conversion. They claim for the church all the glory of the latter day. So, Brother Thomas understands is that Israel will go back to their land because of the promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God has not cast them off, never to bring them back again into his covenant. And it was not right to apply those passages to the church. Rather, the restoration of the Jews to Palestine, as you all have read, forms the very keystone to the whole political structure of the world. Let's open our Bibles then at Isaiah chapter 11. Well-known words which, of course, in the opening verses speak to us of the reign of the Lord Jesus Christ, he who is the stem out of Jesse. But I'm going towards the end of the chapter in verse 11, where following that wonderful description, he describes the pattern of return. Verse 11, it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people which shall be left from Assyria and from Egypt and from Pathros and from Cush and from Elam and from Shinar and from Hamath and from the islands of the sea, a vast range of places. And he shall set up an ensign for the nations, and shall assemble the outcasts of Israel, and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. Some people, when we talk about the return of Israel, have suggested that it might refer to that return from Babylon. And yet this passage doesn't talk about the first time, it talks about the second time. And the places that this return comes from is not merely Babylon, although Shinar is mentioned in that passage. It is from the islands of the sea and from the four corners of the earth. It cannot refer to Babylon. Move on to Ezekiel chapter 37, a passage which is very well known for the first section of the chapter, the Valley of the Dry Bones vision. Now, of course, we've read together the second half of the chapter, which describes how Israel will be brought back into that covenant and how they will have a beloved shepherd, David their king, who is, of course, none other than the Lord Jesus. Verse 16. Moreover, thou son of man, take thee one stick and write upon it for Judah and for the children of Israel his companions, and take another stick and write upon it for Joseph the stick of Ephraim and for all the house of Israel his companions, and join them together. So 2 sticks were to be joined together. You see on the one hand Judah and on the other Joseph, joined together in the hand of the prophet. It's useful to think back to the time when the nation was divided in the days of Rehoboam, and you had Judah in the south and Israel in the north. But in the prophets such as Hosea and Isaiah, we find that the northern kingdom is referred to as Ephraim. So we can associate the Joseph that we read of here with that northern kingdom. Now again, Ezekiel is not talking about the return from Babylon. Zerubbabel was not their prince that we read of in verse 25. He certainly didn't reign forever, and neither was the temple built forevermore. So we have, in fact, 2 classes in that group of people who returned, just as they were those who returned after the Babylon invasion. Those who lived in Judah may have comprised some of Israel as well, while in this prophecy, those who are scattered abroad outside of Israel are called Joseph. But look how the prophecy goes on. Verse 19. Say unto them, thus saith the Lord, behold, I will take the stick of Joseph, which is in the hand of Ephraim, the northern kingdom, and the tribes of Israel his fellows, and will put them with him, even with the stick of Judah, and will make them one stick. Now here are 2 parts being joined, but the significant point is where they're being joined. I will take the children of Israel from among the heathen whither they be gone, and will gather them on every side, and bring them into their own land, and make them one nation in the land. Judah is already in the land. Israel, the scattered, are being brought to Judah and joined with him in the land. So it seems that from these verses there is a sense of precedence, that what he calls Judah is established in the land first, and then those of scattered Israel are brought to him and joined with him subsequently in the land. And you seem to get a sense of this as we read that passage again from Brother Thomas, where he says, there is then a partial and primary restoration of Jews, what the prophet referred to as Judah, and then subsequently the basis of future operations in the restoration of the rest of the tribes at a later date. Judah in the land, Israel, Ephraim, to join them there. We have the same pattern, perhaps a little more clearly, in Zechariah chapter 10. As we draw towards the end of our brief conclusion of some of these key prophecies, just note in Zechariah chapter 10 and verse 3, mine anger was kindled against the shepherds, and I punished the goats, for the Lord of hosts hath visited his flock, the house of Judah. Judah again are specifically mentioned first. And indeed, we have the phrase in Zechariah 12, I won't turn to now, which says, I will save the tents of Judah first, which is what Brother Thomas quoted in that earlier quotation. So we have Judah first, and then in verse 6, I will strengthen the house of Judah, and I will save the house of Joseph, and bring them together. And then verse 7 talks about Ephraim again, and verse 8 is going to hiss for Ephraim and gather the scattered subsequently, and then join them back together in the land. And so, as we referred already to that quotation from Brother Thomas just at the end there, in explaining this restoration in 2 parts, I will save the tents of Judah first. This is the first stage of restoration. What about Britain? Well, just a brief reference here. This is one of the passages that Brother Thomas did directly refer to in Isaiah chapter 18. Woe to the land shadowing with wings, which is beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, that sendeth ambassadors by the sea, even in vessels of bulrushes upon the waters. Very far into that passage to understand that there is in fact clearly both a sense of a navy and of an island, and that's what Brother Thomas brings out. The geography of this passage points to the lion power of Tarshish. Of course, it doesn't say Tarshish there, but it does in other passages, as to the land shadowing with wings. But the British power is still further indicated by its insular position of its seat of government. For the sending of fleet messengers by the sea implies a navy, and the shadowing power is an island state. So without going into this in any more detail, I'm sure you'll appreciate we don't have time this morning, there's just a pointer to one of the lines of evidence that drove Brother Thomas to the conclusion that Britain was fulfilling or would fulfill that role. And obviously there are many books, such as Cry of the Prophets by Brother Paul Billington, that outlines that in more detail. So a very brief review of some of the key passages that underlie those predictions. Israel to return to their land, Britain to support that return. But there was one more key prediction. The power of the Turkish Empire will be dried up or overturned. This is a telescope, and it stands as a brief summary of the way that the book of Revelation works. There are, there are 7 seals, and the 7th seal opens out like a telescope to reveal that within there are 7 trumpets. And within the 7 trumpets, there are 7 vials or bowls of judgment. And within that, there are 7 thunders. Now, in this telescopic structure, we find in chapter 9, when we're in the 6th trumpet period, these words. Saying to the 6th angel which had the trumpet, loose the 4 angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. Now, the Euphrates is the river of Turkey, just as the Nile is the river of Egypt. And just as the first plague in Exodus came on Egypt and was a judgment upon it, so when we read in Revelation in the symbolic language about something coming out of the river, we're dealing with that geographical area. In fact, we can go back in history to the time between the 11th and 15th centuries when the power of the Turkish Empire grew and extended from the east, as you see there, in 4 waves, exactly as we would be led to expect from Revelation 16. But you see, there's a reversal of the process too. For in the 6th vial in Revelation chapter 16 we read, the 6th angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates. We've just read of that in chapter 9. And the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. So on the one hand, we have in chapter 9 powers in the Euphrates being loosed, and on the other in chapter 16 we have them being dried up, which is clearly a reversal of the process. Go back to that diagram and just look at it another way. We'll have time going right to left. It's a sort of Hebrew method, but you'll see the reason why in a minute. You'll see the reason why. Start off in Revelation chapter 9 in the 6th trumpet, and remember those 4 powers that came out of the east, all the Mongols and the Seljuks and the Ottomans and so on, and they came out and invaded Europe and the Middle East and took it over. But in chapter 16, we have the record of the 6 vials. And they, in fact, at the end of that period, the Euphrates is dried up, and the end of those powers. So, we can add Turkey to our list. It is the big sign, in fact, for which Brother Thomas initially was looking, that would enable all the other things to happen. Now, if that's too complicated, let me boil it down to 3. The Jews are to return to the land of Israel. They're to be assisted by Britain. And Turkey is to dry up. Those are the 3 big things for which our early brethren and sisters were looking. That was the basis of their hope. And now, of course, we have to review what actually happened. We go back to the time when Sir Moses Montefiore was a huge force in Jewry. He married, I think, one of the daughters of the Rothschilds, the famous banking firm, and did so well in trade that by the age of 40 he was able to retire. That's quite a nice idea. And he had 60 more years to enjoy his retirement because he lived till the age of 101. And he busied himself with the concerns of Jews as they returned to the land and lobbied in all sorts of ways. He visited Israel 7 times, and in the course of such visits identified poverty and distress in all sorts of ways, and established, as you see here, all sorts of good causes to help the Jewish people in the land. A hospital, a sewing and washing institution, and a lying-in society, which I understand is a place where pregnant women can go, not something for lazy teenagers. He built a windmill and almshouses, and that windmill is there to this day. In 1855, Brother Thomas actually sent a donation of money to Sir Moses for the specific purpose of helping the Jews in the land. And the following year, the Sultan of Turkey made a significant step in allowing some Jews to return, specifically for the purpose of agriculture. Now, in 1871, Brother Thomas died, and Brother Roberts took over as well. He had founded the Christadelphian magazine. And in the course of those appeals that were going out from Sir Moses and other people to help the Jews who had returned, he asked for donations, and the Brotherhood responded. But just take a moment to read a couple of those. That in the yellow box, I wish to add my mite to the blessing of Israel. This is brethren and sisters who understand the promises of Genesis chapter 12 and onwards. We have much pleasure in the brown of forwarding the enclosed in behalf of our beloved country. And in the green, I am amongst those who long for the prosperity of Zion, and therefore send what I can to increase the fund for the Jewish colonization of Palestine, hoping that others will do the same. These people were not rich in this world's goods, but the hope of Israel had touched a flame, had burned and set alight a flame that burned in their hearts. And of course, it gives us exhortation today in a comparatively prosperous society. By 1877, Brother Roberts felt able to write down the progress that was being made along the way, the fulfillment of these signs, in his book Prophecy and the Eastern Question. Turkey had already been called the sick man of Europe, and he wrote it, you might just be able to make out there, the words at the top, the approaching fall of the Ottoman Empire, the settlement of the Jews in Syria under British protectorate. Those 3 key elements I referred to are there on the front page. I can see evidence, says Brother Roberts, of the fulfillment, at the beginnings of the fulfillment of them. And the contents of that booklet were significant in what we've already seen. You can see there that in Ezekiel 38, the Jews to return to colonies, British to be the Tarshish power, the Turkish Empire in Revelation 9 and 16. This is a booklet for the general public, and explaining how the purpose of God would be fulfilled. He says, the one great barrier in the way of all such schemes hitherto has been the uncertainty of life and property in Syria, for which we can read Israel, under the Turkish government. Under British protection, this state of uncertainty would soon vanish, and the formation of a Jewish settlement on the scale required by prophecy would be a matter of a very few years. So you can see the connection between the decline of Turkey and the rise of Britain in supporting Israel as a key sign. He sent that to W.E. Gladstone, who had only 3 years earlier stopped being Prime Minister. I think he had several terms. And he was perhaps surprised to receive back a response from said Gladstone. Allow me to thank you for your tract, which I shall read with great interest, for I have been struck with the apparent ground for the belief that the state of the East may be treated of in that field where you have been labouring. A somewhat convoluted sentence, which I think boils down to, there may be something in what you say from the Bible. Now, an enterprising brother sent this quotation to all sorts of newspapers. PR is not an entirely new thing. And it was published, given that express quotation from the Prime Minister, with great interest. The booklet was sent to all the members of the House of Commons and all the members of the House of Lords. There were requests from it from ordinary people up and down the country who were fascinated by what this man was saying. Brother Robert said it was the biggest testimony to the truth that could be imagined, and it would have required a lot more money to have brought it about. Well, we move on to an interesting character, Sir Lawrence Oliphant, as you see there, secretary to Lord Elgin of Elgin marble fame. He was briefly an MP and got involved with some very strange religious sects. Not the Christadelphians, I hasten to add. As part of his commitment, though, it seems he became obsessed with the idea that the Jews should return to Palestine, and in fact moved to Haifa in 1872 and settled there. Of course, Brother Robert saw in him an opportunity of channeling funds. He was there as a recipient of funds to pass them on to the Jews, and in fact in 1882 sent £300, which one calculation has put at about £30,000 today. That money collected by the brothers and sisters of his day. In the letter which Brother Roberts wrote to him, one of the letters, subsequent letters of donations that they sent, he said, "In addition to the money, a considerable quantity of articles of clothing has accumulated in the hands of a few lady friends in Birmingham for Jewish use in the Holy Land. The articles have been produced at sewing meetings held for the purpose, and are all good, made of substantial fabric and not of charity stuff." My wife tells me that stuff is a technical term. It doesn't mean just whatever you happen to have lying around. So there is therefore a good and honourable Christadelphian tradition of sewing garments for the Holy Land that goes back at least 125 years. Oliphant channeled some of that money into colonies such as that at Zikron Yaakov, as it's now known, still there in Israel today. It was initially set up as a brewery, and in fact, as with so many of the other colonies, it provided help to those who were living there. In January 1888, Oliphant went to what as much of the Christadelphian office as it then existed in Birmingham, and met Brother Roberts and Brother Vickers Collier and a Brother William G. Brother Collier was a seed cultivator who had his own business and travelled subsequently to Palestine and brought back seeds and advertised them in his catalogue. Brother William G. had a small holding and kept bees, and was a very enterprising idea, and his proposal was what they met to discuss, how the developing life in Palestine might be aided. And for a time in the 1880s, it certainly looked as though all those prophecies were beginning to come to pass. People actually returned to the land, helped by Oliphant and those other people. And then, on the 23rd of December, 1888, Oliphant died at the early age of 59. It must have been a blow to Brother Roberts and to those other brothers and sisters who had seen him as a means of aiding the Jews. Indeed, from a human perspective, without people like Oliphant and the Rothschilds, the Jewish bankers, and Sir Moses Montefiore I mentioned before, without them, from a human perspective, perhaps the colonies would not have survived. But of course, as Brother Roberts said, God's purpose does not rely merely in human hands. In 1893, the Christadelphians in Birmingham held a series of 4 lectures in the town hall in Birmingham, or the city hall as we know it today. I'm sorry, the other way around. And in actual fact, it was well attended, and a booklet was published with those lectures in it. And the return of Israel was a key point that Brother Roberts emphasised in his talk. But so also was the decline of the Turkish Empire. Next, look at the state of the Turkish Empire. Once it was the terror of Europe. It sent forth hordes of fanatical horsemen who swept over Europe like a deluge and threatened to inundate the whole of Christendom. And indeed, compared with that, you see at 1600, you can see by 1900 it had dried up, and since 1848 it had also dried up immensely. The beginnings of the process of the decline of that great empire, which had led to the collapse of Constantinople in 1453, was well underway, and Brother Roberts could refer to it. So there is some evidence, says Brother Roberts, for sign 1 and sign 3. But there was yet a prelude to a greater event. For in 1896, Theodor Herzl wrote his book, The Jewish State, in which he outlined the hope of the return of the Jews. The idea which I have developed in this pamphlet, he said, is a very old one, the restoration of the Jewish state. The earth resounds with the outcries of the Jews, and their outcries have awakened the slumbering idea. It was indeed a cry which touched a chord with Jewry in Europe. Brother Roberts was aware, as were the brothers and sisters of the time, of the sign and wrote about it in the magazine. But the sands of time were running out for Brother Roberts. He fell asleep in September 1898. In 1901, Brother and Sister Frank Janaway and Brother C.C. Walker travelled to the land. As you see there, adopted, at least for some of the time, the garb with which travellers would be dressed. Brother Charles Walker was more usually known in that guise. Now, within Zionism and this growing movement, there were two views. Herzl was of the view that, well, as long as there was a place that the Jews could go, a homeland for them to live in, that would be adequate, free from persecution. Whereas another group, a lot of them from Russia, who had endured persecution, said, no, it has to be Israel. It has to be Palestine. In actual fact, in 1903, the British government offered Herzl Uganda. And at that year's conference, the Baal Conference, they were split over the issue. And Herzl was unable to reconcile the differing views. But in the following year, he died in 1904. He had crystallized the idea of the return of the Jews to their, of the return of the Jews somewhere, and garnered international support. But God's purpose was they must go back to the land of Israel, not Uganda or anywhere else. And so, perhaps in the divine purpose, he was removed. Chaim Weizmann then features largely in our story. Born in 1872 in Russia, he in fact came to this country, to Manchester, and became significantly involved in the moves to support Zionism and a return to the land of Israel in specific. The articles recently published in the Testimony magazine have given a fascinating insight into the moves that led ultimately to the Balfour Declaration, including Chaim Weizmann among them. I believe you can now subscribe online to the Testimony. Is that right, David? Yeah. He succeeded in gaining a post at Manchester University in the chemistry department and moved in high circles. He came into contact with Arthur Balfour, who was then about to stop being the Prime Minister in 1906 during the election campaign, when perhaps he should have been fighting the election. It was said of him he was a good statesman rather than a good politician. He said, tell me, why is it that you insist that Palestine is the home for the Jews, not just anywhere? And for various reasons, he ended up asking that question of Chaim Weizmann, who said, tell me, if I were to offer you Paris instead of London, would you take it? And Balfour said, well, we have London. True, said Weizmann. And when London was a marsh, we had Jerusalem. That seems to have sowed a seed in Balfour's mind, which took operation and came to fruition, as we shall see later. Meanwhile, Brother Janaway continued to go back to the land. He went, I think, 4 times, and each time wrote back long and interesting and humorous articles in the magazine, complete with photographs. In one of these, he was able to testify to the development of the colonies in Israel. Jewish colonies have greatly multiplied in the suburbs of Jerusalem. Each one of these little colonies is an evidence that when Ezekiel penned his prophecies, he made no false claim in saying, thus saith the Lord. For here we are, walking about the unwalled villages, talking with the people brought forth out of the nations. There's one of his photos published in the magazine at one of the settlements, the Jewish settlements that he visited. He was also distressed to see that in the hospital in Jerusalem there were beds not occupied, not because they weren't sick, but because they weren't funded. And so he communicated with Brother Charles Walker in Birmingham, and they agreed to fund a bed, which they called the Elpis Israel bed, that it might give them hope, said Brother Walker. And then in 1914 he wrote a book, Palestine and the Jews. He was all about the prophecy of Israel returning to their land, and specifically the evidence that there was in the land of the fulfillment of those signs from the Jewish colonies that were now beginning to spring up everywhere. He listed all the colonies then in existence, and it was recognized even by the Jewish Chronicle as a useful reference work. Now, during the First World War, as it began to develop, there was acute distress amongst the Jews who had gone back to Palestine. In fact, there was a mass exodus to Egypt, of all places. And Brother Walker and the brethren at that time were concerned and sent donations to the Jewish Colonial Trust for the relief of Jews. I took an analysis, and this is just from the entries in the Christadelphian magazine, of the monies that were sent to support the Jews for the relief of Jewish refugees and to help their resettlement in Palestine. It was labelled. And as you see there, it peaked in 1916 at that critical point during the First World War. It may be that the donations were greater even than this, but that's the pattern from just taking those that you find in the Christadelphian magazine. Armageddon is preceded, said Brother Walker, by a colonization of Palestine by Jews of sufficient importance to provoke the desires of the King of the North to take a spoil. We look for such a protectorate as the outcome of the present war. Here is a war in which Britain is involved and Turkey is involved. How might it not be that God's purpose could be fulfilled? The angels were certainly busy. Weizmann at university had accidentally come across a method for producing acetone, which was a key component of cordite, an explosive. And eventually he got called in by Winston Churchill, who asked him, could he produce 30,000 tons of the stuff? And Weizmann said, well, yes, although he'd only actually produced a few test tubes, but he was convinced he could, and of course he did, and thereby had the ear of prominent and leading people in this country, Churchill, Balfour, Lloyd George, the Prime Minister. And thus it was that he was able to influence the discussions which led to the Balfour Declaration. By this time, Arthur Balfour, back in government, not this time as Prime Minister, but as Foreign Secretary. Discussions with dear Lord Rothschild. I've always wondered who this dear Lord Rothschild was. Well, of course, he was the descendant of the Rothschilds, the family. He was actually the son of Sir Nathaniel de Rothschild, the first Jewish peer, and a bit eccentric. Yes, that really is a tortoise he's riding on. And that really is a zebra pulling his carriage in his estate in Tring in Hertfordshire. But he was recognised at that time as a foremost representative of the Jews in this country. And so it came to pass that the British government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Now, this is such a significant statement. You think about that split I described that Herzl had to battle with between those Jews who said a homeland anywhere and those who said it has to be Palestine. And here was the British government saying, here's a homeland for the Jews, and what's more, it's got to be Palestine, and we'll help you go back. What a significant moment it was. And here's a photo of Brother Charles Ladson, who had a series every month on the Jews and Zionism. And many thanks for that photograph that Brother Don helped me to find. There would be few ecclesias where on the Sunday morning following the declaration, the theme would not be joyfully enlarged upon, and the whole service in prayers, hymns and anthems be warmly touched with the emotion generated by such a vindication of our faith. It was a profoundly moving occasion, but yet more was to follow in such a short time. Scarcely was the magazine published than events were happening in Jerusalem. For Lord George, the Prime Minister, had commissioned General Allenby to liberate Jerusalem by Christmas 1917. So Allenby, who read his Bible every day, understood it was the Jewish feast of Hanukkah and got off his horse and walked into Jerusalem. And now consider what has happened. In 1 month in November, we have the British government supporting the return of the Jews to Israel, and the very next month, the British have liberated Jerusalem from the Turkish power. You can see the connection and the excitement of the brethren and sisters. Those key signs that we started off with, the return of the Jews to their land, supported by Britain and enabled by the drying up of the Turkish Empire, had begun to be fulfilled before their very eyes. It was indeed a significant moment. I'm going to move on to 1923, or thereabouts. There's Brother Archie and Sister Emily Burt, who lived in Fremantle Square in Bristol. They're actually my mother's grandparents. Brother Archie gave an address entitled Britain in Palestine, What the Mandate Means. And it's interesting as evidence as to how the brothers and sisters viewed those events in their own time. I shall read it just in case the writing foxes you. 5 weeks after declaration published, by which of course he means the Balfour Declaration, Jerusalem was taken by General Allenby, and the long reign of Turkish misrule and desolating tyranny was ended. Great joy throughout Jewry, and there was profound gratitude and thanksgiving to God from Christadelphians in all parts of the world. Sorry, halfway down that slide. We shall not soon forget the thoughts and feelings aroused when on opening our morning papers we read in huge type, Jerusalem free. Why were we so moved? Because Jesus had declared, Luke 21, that Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. What a marvellous demonstration of the hand of God at work, and brethren and sisters able to show it to their friends. Britain administered that land until 1920, when at the San Remo Conference, Britain was appointed provisionally as the mandatory power. And there was a large area of land, as you see, that constituted Palestine under the British mandate. Clause by clause of the mandate was examined in minute detail in the Christadelphian magazine. Special lectures were held in Rhyl, in North Wales of all places. One was held and 180 visitors attended. Sir Herbert Samuel was appointed, a prominent Jew, as the High Commissioner for Palestine. And indeed, the Jews were greatly gladdened by this event, seeing in him one who could develop the land. But he appointed Haj Mohammed Amin al-Husseini as the representative of the Arabs. And no doubt he intended, by appointing somebody who was well known to the Arabs and respected by them, no doubt he hoped to be able to bring things peacefully together. But al-Husseini, known as the Mufti, had already been sentenced to 15 years hard labour by the British government for an attack that he had arranged on Jews praying at the Western Wall. More was to be heard of him later. When it came to the League of Nations to try to ratify the mandate that had been provisionally given, there were strange delays. There was a hidden hand at work. Who could possibly have prevented and wanted to prevent the return of Israel to their land under British protection? Chaim Weizmann, as we see there, had no doubt. The Vatican was the leader of all the dark forces which it was trying to organise into an anti-Jewish and anti-Zionist campaign, assuming the dimensions of the Dreyfus case. Dreyfus case being an infamous anti-Semitic legal trial that in fact sparked Herzl's interest in the first place. Disharmony and distrust sadly characterised the succeeding years. Whereas that was the land under the British mandate in 1920, by 1923, Transjordan had been split off and the area reduced, the area of Palestine reduced, and ultimately, of course, became the Kingdom of Jordan. Earlier generation of statesmen had been inspired by the Bible teaching, not least Churchill. But pro-Arab views began to develop increasingly, and riot and disorder developed in the land, led not least by al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti himself. As we move towards the end of the 1930s, of course, Hitler's atrocities are well documented. But the beginning of these before the war itself was Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, when horrendously 267 synagogues were burned, 100 Jews were killed, 7,500 Jewish shops were smashed, and 30,000 Jews placed in concentration camps. British Jewish leaders went to see Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister, and appealed, could not something be done? Could not the people of Britain help at least the children of the Jews? And the Cabinet approved a proposal which led to the so-called Kindertransport of children being taken out of Germany and brought to this country and taken in by the British people. That, in fact, started a month later than Kristallnacht itself. There are all sorts of amazing stories on the website that you can see there. Christadelphians who took in Jews and looked after them. One such was Brother Alan Overton, who even in Rugby established an Elpis Israel house for Jewish refugees, looked after by brethren and sisters, I think. There's an account in that website to which I referred of a lady called Vera Gissing, who remembers a school friend called Honza, who was taken in and went by Brother Alan. And later on, when Honza went to visit him, he brought down from the loft his proudest possession, a cardboard box with over 200 labels, name tags that the children had worn round their necks when they arrived in England and came into his care. Each tag represented a life that he had saved. Hannah and Ruth Offner. Hannah, or Sister Hannah as she now is, married to a brother and living in Australia because a brother and sister in Birmingham took her in. Meanwhile, in 1939, the British government published a white paper, or a black paper, as the Jews were later to call it. It restricted the immigration of Jews to the land of Israel to a tiny percentage per year, and would lead to them becoming a minority in their own land. Meanwhile, the Brotherhood continued to try to help. I've mentioned individuals taking people in, and the Elpis Israel house in Rugby. There was, of course, one in Birmingham, looked after by a Dr. and Mrs. Hirsch, Jews, who took in about 20 boys aged from between 14 and 15 and a half. And this building and this enterprise was financed by the ecclesias in Birmingham and Coventry. And they were taught all sorts of useful trades and skills, including shorthand by a certain brother L.G. Sargent. Of course, as the war proceeded, the horrors of Auschwitz began to become apparent. In the news today, did you hear the discussion that was taking place about how essential it was that school children should go and see the horrors of that time? And sympathy in the Brotherhood and in the world, more to the point, was becoming apparent. So that when ships went back to the land, full of Jews escaping from the horrors after the war, they were turned away by the British, who, of course, were taking to heart the white paper that had limited the numbers of Jews that could return to the land. It was indeed a shameful time. In Israel itself, David Ben-Gurion rose to prominence, not this time a diplomat perhaps like Weizmann, but more as a tough soldier, and he led the fight for a state. But his fight did not concern, as it did others, the need to blow up people. The Stern and Ergen gangs, sadly, were more involved in that, although Ben-Gurion separated himself from it. But at the end of the war, when the country threw out Winston Churchill and appointed the Labour leader Clement Attlee, he appointed in turn Ernest Bevin to look after the affairs of the Palestine. And increasingly, Britain was compromising with its Arab friends to the expense of Israel. In 1946, the Ergen blew up the King David Hotel. 91 people were killed. And it was perhaps one of the events which contributed to Britain's feeling that it was unable to continue supporting and keeping the mandate. And in due course, on the 2nd of April 1947, they decided to resign the mandate. But this decision left a vacuum which the Zionists would fill. Britain returned the mandate to the United Nations, and therefore there was no clear mandatory power over them. Israel knew when the mandate would expire, and they arranged their own state, and they arranged to proclaim it, knowing within hours of when the mandate itself would expire. Golda Meir, in her diaries, records at exactly 4 p.m. the ceremony began. Ben-Gurion, wearing a dark suit and tie, stood up and rapped the gavel. According to the plan, this was to be the sign for the orchestra to play Hatikvah, but something went wrong. But still, spontaneously, they rose to their feet and they sang their national anthem. Yet is our hope not lost, the ancient hope to dwell in the land of our fathers, in the city where David encamped. And those words had been written by a Jewish colonist back in the 19th century, and he was the secretary to Mr. Lawrence Oliphant. Ben-Gurion cleared his throat and said quietly, "I shall now read the Scroll of Independence." It only took him a quarter of an hour. And so we have reached the end of our survey of the 100 years from 1848 to 1948, the unfolding of God's purpose. What conclusions can we draw? 3, I think, briefly. Firstly, that the purpose of God is absolutely certain. No word falls from him that is not fulfilled. As certainly as the rain drops from heaven, his word will fulfill the purpose to which he sends it. He declared that he would bring Israel back from dispersion into those countries, into that country of Israel. He declared that Britain would have a hand in helping it to happen. And the exhortation to us each one is our life filled with that same excitement for those things that are going on as evidence of his hand at work in the world? Is our love for his people as strong as those of our early brethren and sisters whom we have thought about? And secondly, I think we need to be careful about our roles and our players in prophecy, don't we? Brother Thomas had the certainty that Britain would have a role in returning Israel to the land, and Britain did. And later on, Britain pulled back from that role. But there is no reason to think that come the end, when we read in Ezekiel 38 that Tarshish will say, "Art thou come to take a spoil?" that they will not fulfill their role. We must not make the Bible say more than it says, but equally we must not make it say less either. And thirdly, timescales. It has been longer than even the most lengthy of our early brethren anticipations, and some of them went longer into the future than we perhaps realise. But the lesson, of course, is that the Almighty is testing each one of us and giving us an opportunity, each one of us, to respond to his love, that he might bring us into his kingdom. So let us focus our minds on that hope as we live each day waiting for his coming, that when he returns we might say with Israel redeemed, "Lo, this is our God, we have waited for him."